Imagine a coral reef. The damselfish flicks its fins as it hides underneath stony coral to aid its photosynthesis. The currents that transport nutrients across limestone structure, where corals spawn and settle. The zooxanthellae that colonize the coral tissue and provide the energy of their hosts. The stony coral animal that absorbs calcium carbonate from seawater to form its habitats. The reef microbiome that binds CO2 and produces the oxygen of Earth's atmosphere pulsing with life. We are symbionts on a symbiotic planet, and if we care to, we can find symbiosis everywhere. Lynn Margulis. Together with you, I'd like to immerse in the urgent question of developing a design methodology that abandons extractive modes of mining in favor of growing anorganic matter within the symbiotic relationships of marine holobionts. I will draw on a currently emerging interest in symbiosis as a term for imagining these other forms of co-production and coexistence. And I seek to develop my terminology from a perspective of evolutionary theory of symbiogenesis. Or in short, I want to take you on a dive into a symbiotic ocean. As a designer, I focus on material processes, their production cycles, and the narratives that unfold through these materialities. And I'm engaging in forms of ecological thinking and material performativity derived from Anna Zink's notion of learning to live amidst ruins. In the face of profound human impact on planetary systems, the global ocean, as the main source of life, is fundamentally transforming its interactions, flows, and ecologies. These critical changes raise questions about the coexistence of humans on Earth, on the terrestrial, but also below sea level. The coral reef can be viewed as a prototypical ecology for these symbiotic system relationships. Symbiosis defines the marine microbiome across all scales, so from species-related networks to microbiological scales. And as former biologist and professor for feminist and technoscience Donna Haraway pointed out, the marine biome in general and the coral reef in specific as a critical zone serve as model organisms for symbiotic system relationships. Haraway's writing, as some of you might know, traces its origins to the seminal work of biologist Lynn Margulis, who revived the evolutionary theory of symbiogenesis based on the preliminary work of Russian evolutionary biologists Kozo-Polyansky and Konstantin Mereschkowsky. When Margulis published her theory in the 1970s, she provoked and disturbed not only as a female academic in a male-dominated natural science discourse, but also with her strong opposition towards a widely held neo-Darwinian model of evolution. So her concept challenged the idea of evolutionary competition, the hypothesis of random mutation as a driver of selfish survival in favor of a collaborative model of survival through symbiosis. One could argue that Margulis' theory resurrects Darwin's alternative representation of evolution in the form of a coral, an anarchically growing shape that no longer upholds mankind as the crown of evolution, as Horst Bredekamp once put it. The coral of life, as it's found in these Darwin's notebooks, is in close relation to Mereschkowski's endosymbiotic tree of life and Lynn Margulis' later extension to the five kingdoms. So why should we as designers and artists delve so deeply in evolutionary theory? When design begins to think about matter as a growing system, we raise questions of evolutionary development that have far-reaching consequences for our modes of making. My research is based on the work of Wolf Hilberts and Tom Gouraud. As early as 1970, the German architect and oceanographer and his colleague from biochemistry developed the so-called biorock principle. So naturally dissolved minerals in seawater accrete on a conductive steel scaffold, which provides an ideal medium for the settlement of marine animals. Today, this technology is widely used to restore coral reefs, and I visited one of these projects on the island of Curaçao to learn about the technological implications and the actions of care of such an underwater garden. Hilbert's historical research introduced a process of underwater electrolysis of low voltage electricity. And the system makes it possible to actually grow limestone on conductive steel scaffolds in the ocean. My sketch here explains the principle. So when a small electric current is passed between anode and cathode on a steel structure, minerals accrete on the surface. And what is interesting, of course, is the forms of marine life that slowly form on these limestone structures. Working with so-called pristine ecological seascapes, such as coral reef, confronts us with the ruins we ourselves have created. So my PhD project, Symbiogenesis, researches on the troubled and symbiotic relationships between mineral matter and marine life at Zurich University of the Arts and the Cluster of Excellence and Matters of Activity, but mainly underwater while I'm diving. When I was diving in a former construction site at the mega pier of Curaçao, I witnessed the devastating consequences of human impact on seascapes. The former reef turned into a desert and has not generated one bit within the following 5 years. The ecological, infrastructural, material, and technological layers of such an anthropo-ocean, as Clouet and Bourgidou call it, are irreversibly inscribed in the ocean and need to be negotiated when thinking about our conservation practices these days. In addition to the BioRock principle, Hilbert's introduced a conception of man that takes into account natural processes and common survival needs, but remains central to the regulation of the evolutionary system. He called it cybertecture. The neologism gives a hint to Hilbert's understanding of architecture as a logical extension of the principles of cybernetics to the built environment. So he might be inspired by Norbert Wiener's famous concept of cybernetics. However, this notion also perhaps unintentionally situates the human in the center of system control. The concept of the designer as a helmsman, kybernetikos is Greek for good at steering, in full control of the system and responsible for its well-being, needs to be decoded in the ecological discourse of a decade that was just beginning to embrace environmental consciousness with great authors such as Rachel Carson. The conclusion that humanity is capable and justified in repairing damaged ecosystems, such as coral reefs, fits seamlessly into this narrative and is a common thread throughout Hilbert's writings. Case in point, the BioRock co-inventor Thomas Garreau eventually named his technology electrotherapy, a name that suggests that coral reefs should be viewed as patients that need treatment. The planet takes care of us, not we of it, Margulis states in her influential book, A Symbiotic Planet. Rather than regulating the incredibly complex system relationships of an ecology or even going as far as to cure the ocean as a sick patient, Margulis' perspective suggests a questioning of this role of the human in favor of much more modest and highly interconnected perspectives. Some voices in biology echo this transformative notion of conservation when they say coral reef ecosystems of the future and the associated management and government approaches used to protect them are probably going to be unlike anything we've previously seen. So the question is, what needs to be managed, why, and how? Based on the BioRock principle, I started to construct first underwater prototypes, and instead of originally used heavy armory steel, in my case, spun steel yarns mineralize into limestone surfaces that will provide a habitat for other forms of life. My work focuses on reducing the material impact by applying filigree conductible yarns to construct lightweight marine prototypes, a technology that literally allows me to weave stone. Central to my models is the idea of bioreceptivity. Cruz and Beckett introduced this term to talk about creating surfaces for architecture that invite proliferating forms of growth. Together with dive schools, local manufacturers, and biologists, I spent most of my design research in the field and below sea level. I shape immersive underwater methods for design, prototype these sympoietic material experiments, and research on the design ontological impact of them. Besides my fieldwork in Curaçao, which you can see here, I will spend my second summer on the research station Staresso in Corsica, together with biologists from Max Planck Institute, Jordan Lab. Working with biologists means not only to attune to marine habitats, but also to the alien protocols of biologists in research stations. With my underwater prototypes, I'm working on creating contact zones between human and other than human entities. These architectures of cohabitation mediate between animate and inanimate matter, between man-made and nature-cultural ecosystems, between human and environmental agency. Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble, applied Margulis' theory of symbiogenesis to philosophy and system theory. She introduced a form of thinking and making which she called sympoiesis, together creation, with human and other than human actors. While Haraway argues for transferring sympoietic forms of production to the humanities and the arts, activating her theory for design, I do believe holds further potential. Claudia Marais outlined that design currently struggles to liberate itself from a production and profit-oriented paradigm of industrial modernity. Bringing the agency of disturbed environments and their species-rich inhabitants to the foreground of design methodology, we may be able to propose a reinvention of our disciplinary protocols in response to our current ecological and socio-political struggles. A design practice that regards the multispecies agencies of an ecology as central for shaping the design process might be equipped for designing habitats for other than humans. I suggest calling these practices Sympoïetic Design. A number of young designers start to work on these systems together with, for, and by other than humans. The NGO Reefs develops 3D printed bricks for coral restoration. The Symbiotic Spaces Collective works on 3D printed habitats for local wetlands. The biologist Anja Wegner, who I'm diving with this summer, and the artist collective Superflex collaborate on their pink elements for fish architecture, and designer David Enon, here from Paris, has worked on the mineral accretion factory to grow underwater furniture. Deep reflection on the benefits and limitations of working within ecologies is needed. Sympoïetic design raises new questions for our discipline that require further discussion, maybe together with you. Some resulting questions are: how does sympoietic design affect the role of the designer as an author? Who are we actually designing for? What forms of knowledge are needed to implement and evaluate it? What time spans are necessary to facilitate it? And my favorite one, how structured or chaotic will the result be? My own models have stayed underwater for a shorter period of time and show first signs of change being occupied by pioneering organisms. Departing from my first experiments, I'm planning on a long-term underwater installation which will remain in the ocean at the field site of Staresso for an entire year, hopefully. I hope that these projects will show how environments can actually flourish and also chaotically proliferate. I'm currently pursuing a new line of thinking in which I'm trying to integrate the artisanal knowledge of fishing communities and natural fibers into my artificial reef designs. Based on previous works by the NGO Institute of Biomimetics here from France, we are currently trying to raise funds to plan a socially integrated long-term study of coral nurseries in Cartagena in Colombia. Sympoïetic design offers a new view on design as a shared planetary project. Rather than restoring pristine nature, these co-created habitats encourage the designer to relinquish control of the system and incorporate the wildly proliferating, uncurated, unexploitable forms of life into the creation projects. Sponges, algae, electrical circuits, marine biologists, fish, cameras, limestone, polyps become part of these multi-species marine ecologies of symbiotic making. Sympoïetic design opens the door to material practices that transform human-centered design projects into an evolutionary practice for common survival towards a sea change in design, hopefully. Thank you.